Okay, gentlemen, so here we are talking about economic growth, chapter 25. So keep in mind that when we're talking about economic growth, what is sort of required is an increase in per capita GDP. If we have an increase in real GDP, but it's all due to an increase in population, then I think we can argue that people aren't going to experience the good part of economic growth, so it's not really going to do much. We also have to assume that, that growth is a good thing, and we'll talk about some critiques to that argument in a little while. But there's this rule of 70, sometimes it's called the rule of 72, it sort of depends. 70 is a better number, but basically what you can do is take the number 70 and divide it by the annual percentage growth, and that will give you the approximate number of years that it takes to double. This works in just about everything. It works in, you can take 70 and divide it by the interest rate that you're earning, and that will tell you the number of years it takes to double your investment. So that works really well, and it has lots of applications. But we're talking about it in terms of this arithmetic growth in real GDP. So between the 50s and 2009, we have this period of massive economic growth. We're averaging about 3.2% per year, which in the history of the world is pretty outlandish. Real GDP per capita is at around 2%. So obviously we had population growth, and that's why our growth percentage and our per capita growth are different. But even in addition to that, we have products and services that are better than they were. Some people argue that we have more leisure, though dual income households and communications improvements, abilities for people to work from home and stuff. Actually, there's some people who maybe think that that's not true. And then there are other impacts to people's self-esteem and whatnot. So what you can see here are our real GDP in billions. It's all in 2005 dollars, right? So you can see our population is growing, and then therefore you see our real GDP per capita ending, of course, in 2009, which is the last year that info was available for before when this textbook was printed. But basically, you can see that we've had really solid growth. Okay, our GDP is up. It was at 13. It's over 16 trillion now. So real per capita GDP has continued to grow as well. And per capita GDP, of course, is the thing that's well connected to standard of living. So modern economic growth begins in the 1700s. We've had pretty much ongoing increased standards of living, more time for leisure. That is certainly true when compared to, being serfs back in the day. We have the 40-hour work week. We have weekends. Those are things that really didn't exist, prior to the Industrial Revolution. And human lifespan has doubled, which is wonderful in a lot of ways, but it also has given us some problems. And then obviously democracy has risen throughout all of this, which, has, you can make some arguments that democracy has done more for humanity than just about any other thing. So it begins in Britain, and it spreads slowly throughout the world, and it is the primary reason that standards of living have improved. Now, there are some examples of some countries catching up. So obviously, inventing economic improvement is a lot more difficult than copying economic improvement technology. So, for example, the phone was invented in the United States, but in a lot of parts of the underdeveloped world, they're skipping the original phone, the whole wired phone, like the kind that maybe you guys don't even remember, but certainly the kind that I grew up with. To many parts of the developing world, they'll never have a regular phone. They'll go directly to wireless phones, to cell phones. And that's one of those things that can help them leap and have tremendous growth. So you can imagine growth curves, the growth curves look something like this. The more you're growing in the beginning, you can grow very quickly, but as your economy becomes more and more developed, it gets harder and harder to keep up those growth rates. So when you see China or sub-Saharan Africa growing at 7 or 9%, you think, well, why can't the United States do that? We're barely eking out 2.5%. Well, we're in this part of the curve as opposed to underdeveloped nations, which are down here. So you can see some real GDP per capita across the nation. Sorry, these columns don't line up. It's a little ugly. But you can pause and take a look. And here's another interesting graph. So you got the United States in red, and then you can see the much less developed areas. So these are then continents, right? So these are larger areas with a couple of countries cracked out. You've got Asia, excluding Japan, that, you know, in the second half of the 70s really starts to blow up. So what causes this, right? Well, a lot of people, certainly from the economic standpoint, strong property rights are super important. When I own something, I need to know that nobody can take it away from me. Very connected to that is the idea of patents and copyrights. If I invent something and anybody else can just take it, then I have very little incentive to invent, and therefore I won't. Efficient financial institutions, so when I need to borrow money, I need to be able to do it. It needs to be predictable, it needs to be reasonable, it needs to be affordable, and there can't be a lot of graft, there can't be a lot of theft, there can't be a lot of corruption. Literacy and education, so this is basically human capital. People have to be smart, you have to have an employed workforce, you have to be able to trade, and you have to have the competitive market system. So competition puts prices where we need them. These are the institutional structures of growth, and when you look in the underdeveloped world, you can often find, well, there's not a lot of literacy, especially literacy for women, in much of the underdeveloped world. There's not a lot of free trade. There aren't competitive markets. There are maybe no financial institutions, or at least not efficient ones. And property rights and intellectual property oftentimes is not well respected. So it becomes difficult to grow in that situation. So what helps us grow? On the supply side, some things that help us grow are the quantity and quality of natural resources. So this is a huge advantage that the United States has. We have tons of energy, we have tons of water, we have tons of land, tons of room, and that's wonderful. That really helps us be what we are. Our human resources are very good. So we were the first country in the world to have compulsory education, first through 8th grade, then through high school. We had by far the most extensive community college and university system in the world, all through those major growth periods in the 50s, 60s, 70s. The supply or stock of capital goods, so obviously we have great technology and great stuff, right? Machinery and all that kind of jazz, which comes with cheap energy and affordable steel and all those sorts of things that come from the fact that at our level of longitude and all that sort of stuff, we are just in the right place in terms of being able to grow food and having clean water and mining and all that kind of jazz. On the demand side, somebody has to purchase everything that we make. So we're going to learn about the banking system, and you're going to learn how money can multiply and how this pie can grow. But supply factors don't matter if there's nobody to buy on the demand side. And then finally, you must be efficient. So supply and demand have to be efficient. So when we have capital goods and consumer goods, we can push the whole system forward. If we're at point C, then that means we have some of our resources being unemployed. That would be obviously a bad thing. Now, labor and productivity. So our real GDP is the product of the number of hours that we work times our labor productivity. And what you can see is we can change both of these things. So the size of our employed labor force, which has a lot to do with who's working and immigration and all that sort of stuff, and then the average number of hours. So in the United States, our average number of hours is around 40 hours for the work week. But in other parts, of Western Europe, in France, I think they only have a 30-hour work week. So that's going to hurt their GDP, but of course it's going to increase labor. Maybe it'll increase happiness, who knows? But it's certainly not good for growing GDP. Then, in addition to hours of work, we have to talk about productivity. You have to be productive in that time spent. So I'm sure all of you guys have plenty of examples where you studied for hours, but you were so distracted that you didn't actually learn very much while you were studying. So you have lots of hours, but very few, but very low productivity. So what makes us productive? And these are those things. So technology is a huge one. Quantity of capital, when you need to buy a machine in order to help you be more efficient, can you get it? Education, that's why all of you are here. And then making the right decisions, taking making the right stuff, the stuff that is going to help the economy rather than the stuff that isn't going to help the economy. Those are your big factors that drive real GDP. So what you can see here are some growth rates, so you can pause and take a look at that. I think you'll understand it. Now, what gives this productivity growth? So the majority of our growth in productivity, so now we're only looking at that productivity side of that little funnel into real GDP. So technological advance is a huge portion of it. Quantity of capital, education, economies of scale are the lesser influences. So what you can really see is the majority of our increase in productivity is technological advance, right? So we used to need lots and lots of people on any factory floor, but machines are getting better, robots are getting better, and we need fewer and fewer people, which means that each of those people who's left is becoming more and more productive. Now, are we making ourselves productive to the point where we have an employment problem? That's a really good question. Some people are starting to say yes, but there's some other people who think this is just a blip and we're going to get it all figured out. Time will tell. So you can pause here and take a look at some of the educational rankings that we have. And then you can take a look. This, I think, is better when we look at a graph that's going to come up here. So you can read through these. These are just kind of ways that things happen. But I want to get to this. This graph, I think, is really important. So what you see is a productivity index. So it's our base year is 1992. Okay. So 1992 is right about here. This is the base. And what we have is a line of best fit that kinks right here around 1995. So we have productivity growing at about 1.5% annually on average. Then it shifts up to 2.8% annually on average afterward. So our line of best fit only works up until the kink, and then we have this big change. So what's the big change that hit right around 1995? Pause and think about it for a minute. The big change was the internet. The internet has dramatically increased productivity. Now notice that productivity and GDP growth are not the same thing, but they are related. So, is economic growth desirable and sustainable? So some anti-growth folks would say that environmental and resource issues are problematic. They'll point out maybe that we have a finite number of lots of different resources and we are using them too quickly. So basically we are spending money now, but we're going to run out, and then what's going to replace, right? So we're basically burning out all of our stuff, and we're going to have a really hard time in the future when that stuff isn't there maintaining any kind of economic growth. Could be true, right? So whether we're talking about filling the earth with CO2 and how that's problematic, or maybe using up oil or coal or whatever, these kinds of things are certainly potentially problematic. But on the other side of the coin, economic growth gives us a higher standard of living, and in the past, when these sorts of issues, I mean, people have been the Malthusian school, which is this idea that our population is going to be so big that the world is going to basically run out of everything and everyone's going to die or go to war or something. People have been saying that for over 100 years, and it keeps on not happening. Science and technological advance has always figured out a way past these sorts of issues. Now, just because they always have doesn't mean they always will, but we certainly have a decent track record showing that can happen. So growth is the path to greater material abundance. The Catholic Church, and especially under Pope Francis, is asking us whether greater material abundance is really something that we want, particularly up here in the first world where material abundance is already pretty significant. If the greater material abundance all comes to us and it avoids other parts of the world, well, then I think we can say that economic growth is coming on the backs of other people. That's a real argument. We do have higher standards of living based on economic growth, though those increases in standards of living are not necessarily equitable across all socioeconomic lines. Increased leisure time, as I kind of talked about at the beginning, that may or may not be true. There's a lot of people who are working more than they ever have. But certainly human knowledge is exploding. We just know more stuff. The amounts of things that humanity knows is dramatically increasing, and knowledge is always a good thing. So you can pause here and take a look at global competitiveness. It's kind of an interesting thing. And then you can just read a little bit more about China here. Of course, since 2009, when all this was published, some of these numbers and their validity has come under question. So that's kind of working itself out. But that'll do it for Chapter 25. Thanks for listening, and I appreciate it. Take care, guys.